Joseph Stalin made the dark cloud hanging over the Cold War infinitely more sinister. His crimes against his own people were so great as to be immeasurable. 1 million, 10 million, perhaps 40 million Soviet citizens perished during his reign of terror. His was a government run by fear, cruelty, and finally, madness. But in March 1953, the monster met his end, and leadership of the Soviet Union passed to a collective of top Kremlin officials. They sought to distance themselves from Stalin's cruel legacy, but they soon realized that fear and intimidation were the only things keeping them in power. The first test of their authority came almost instantly. In East Germany, Walter Ulbricht ran his government according to the cold-blooded dictates of Stalinism. No one dared challenge his authority for fear of imprisonment or death. Stalin himself boasted that a revolt by the East German people was impossible. Revolt? Why, they won't even cross the street unless the light is green. But in June 1953, they stormed the streets in waves of anti-government protest. The violence quickly spread to cities across East Germany. With Ulbricht's government in peril, Moscow ordered Soviet forces to intervene and put an end to the demonstrations. Hundreds were killed or later executed. The events of the 1953 East German uprising are recounted in a poem by the German poet Bertolt Brecht. After the uprising of the 17 June, the secretary of the Writers' Union had leaflets distributed in the Stalinate, stating that the people had forfeited the confidence of the government and could win it back only by redoubled efforts. Would it not be easier, in that case, for the government to dissolve the people and elect another? In the United States, the new administration had not anticipated the challenge to Soviet authority. Despite his campaign pledge to roll back communism and free the enslaved people of Eastern Europe, President Eisenhower refused to intervene. In the wake of the East German uprising, the top ranks of the Kremlin were reshuffled. When the bloodletting was over, a single man stood at the pinnacle of Soviet government: Nikita Khrushchev. With power consolidated in the Kremlin, the Soviet Union and the Cold War took a dramatic turn. In 1956, Khrushchev rocked the communist world to its core by tearing down the legacy of Stalin himself. Before the 20th Communist Party Congress, he unleashed a fiery 4-hour condemnation of the late Soviet leader and his cult of personality. Stalin abandoned the method of ideological struggle for that of administrative violence, mass repressions, and terror. He possessed a capricious and despotic character, and he was a supreme egotist and sadist, capable of sacrificing anything and anybody for his own power and glory. The impact of the secret speech was immense. It ushered in a period of relative liberalization known as Khrushchev's thaw. By Western standards, the changes were modest. But to the long-suffering people of Eastern Europe, enraged by 10 years of Soviet-style repression, they were cause for revolution. Just months after the secret speech, an uprising by Polish workers challenged Khrushchev to make good on his promises for reform. In its aftermath, Vice President Richard Nixon noted cynically, "It would serve American interests if the Soviets pounded another upstart satellite, such as Hungary, into submission." He got his wish in October of 1956. In the Hungarian capital of Budapest, students and workers demonstrated against the repressive policies of the country's Stalinist government. They demanded an end to the Soviet military occupation, free elections, and the return to power of their deposed prime minister, Imre Nagy. But events quickly spiraled out of control. The Hungarian secret police opened fire on a crowd of demonstrators. But that only fueled the rioting. Symbols of Soviet enslavement were destroyed. Hungarian resistance fighters, or partisans, hunted down and killed government officials. By the next day, Soviet forces had entered the fray, and the city was at war. The partisans fought Soviet tanks using Molotov cocktails and small arms. The American-sponsored Radio Free Europe encouraged the rebels to fight the Soviets to the death. Finally, after nearly a week of violence, an uneasy ceasefire descended on the city. Soviet tanks were withdrawn. Negotiations were commenced to seat a new government in Budapest, independent of Moscow's influence. Against impossible odds, it appeared the heroic freedom fighters had prevailed against the mighty Soviet Union.
At the end of a 6-day fight that astonished the world and shook the Kremlin to its foundations, Hungary was free to fraternize on its own borders and rush in supplies to the stricken city of Budapest along roads littered with burnt-out red tanks, disabled by almost unarmed men fired by passion for liberty. Flaring swiftly from student demonstrations into open revolution, the pent-up hatreds of oppression sent Russian might reeling and forced withdrawal of the red yoke. But even as these scenes were recorded, rumors flared of the re-entry of Russian forces and new fighting. The beautiful city of Budapest, scarred by conflict, again faces a Russian onslaught, even before the debris of the fight for freedom is cleared from the streets.
The world watched and waited, even as tens of thousands of desperate refugees fled for their lives. Khrushchev agonized over what to do next. Could he allow Hungary to determine its own political future? That would mean losing face and perhaps losing the rest of Eastern Europe. In the end, it was too much to concede. On November 4th, Soviet military forces rolled into Hungary with orders to terminate the rebellion. A radio transmission captured the final desperate moments of Hungarian freedom.
We are under heavy machine gun fire. We will hold out till the last drop of blood. Goodbye, friends. God save our souls. The Russians are too near.
In America, the man who promised to roll back communism provided no military support. No diplomatic intervention. Nothing. Budapest lay in ruins. Several thousand were dead. Thousands more were wounded. Imre Nagy was arrested by Soviet forces, imprisoned, and executed. Khrushchev said it would serve as a lesson to all other leaders in socialist countries.